Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. You know we love to explore all sorts of unusual philosophical ideas here.
Yeah, we do.
And today we're diving into one that really twists your brain a bit.
hmm
It's called connexive logic.
Connexive logic.
Now, if you've spent any time at all thinking about the rules of logic, you're probably familiar with classical logic.
Right.
It's kind of like the default setting for how we think about arguments and reasoning.
The standard framework.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But connexive logic comes along and says, hold on a minute. What if we looked at things a little differently?
Right. And not just a little differently, but in a way that classical logic would say, nope, not allowed.
Yeah, exactly. We're not just adding on to classical logic here. We're talking about a completely different system with its own set of rules.
It's contra-classical.
Okay, contra-classical. That sounds pretty rebellious.
Oh, it is. Because it accepts as valid some arguments that classical logic throws out.
Be intriguing. So where does this rebellion start? What's the core idea that sets connexive logic apart?
Well, at its heart, connexive logic is all about connection. It says that for an argument to be valid, there needs to be a real, meaningful link between the premises and the conclusion.
Okay, a real connection, not just some random coincidence.
Right. Classical logic often focuses on whether the premises and the conclusion are true or false, but connexive logic says, sure, truth matters, but is there actually a point to this implication? Does it make sense?
So it's about more than just the truth values lining up. It's about whether the implication actually means something.
Yeah, you got it. And this idea of a genuine connection has some pretty big consequences.
I bet. How does it actually play out in the rules of connexive logic?
Well, one of the key ways is through these principles called Aristotle's theses.
Aristotle's theses. Those sound important.
They are. Now, the first one, known as AT, says it's not possible for something to be true if its opposite is true.
Okay, it sounds pretty basic, like something can't be both true and false at the same time.
Right, but here's the thing. Classical logic says, well, if the premise is false, then the whole implication is automatically true, even if the conclusion is the opposite of the premise. It doesn't care about the connection, just the truth values.
That's where the vacuously true thing comes in, right?
Right. But connexive logic says, no way. Even if the premise is false, there still needs to be a sensible connection to the conclusion.
So it's more strict about how implications work?
It is. It insists on a tighter relationship between the parts of an argument.
I can see how that would shake things up.
Oh, yeah. And there's another Aristotle's thesis called AT prime, which says it's not possible for something to imply its own opposite.
Okay, that also seems fairly intuitive. Like you can't say if it's raining, then it's not raining.
Exactly. It just doesn't make sense. But classical logic allows for that kind of implication as long as the premise is false.
So connexive logic is trying to weed out those kinds of nonsensical statements.
That's one way to put it. It's all about maintaining a sense of coherence and relevance.
I like that, keeping things sensible. Now, we've got Aristotle's theses. Are there any other big players in connexive logic?
Oh, there's another set of principles called Boethius's theses.
Boethius, another famous philosopher.
Yeah. Now, Boethius' theses add another layer to this idea of a genuine connection.
Okay, tell me more. How do they do that?
The first one, BT, says that if A implies B, then A can't also imply not B.
Right, it's like saying if studying hard leads to good grades, it can't also be the case that studying hard leads to bad grades.
Precisely. And the second Boethius thesis, BT prime, flips it around. It says if A implies not B, then A can't also imply B.
So it's about consistency. If A implies a certain thing, it can't also imply the opposite.
Exactly. It keeps the consequences of your implications from contradicting each other. And this idea actually goes back to an ancient Stoic philosopher named Chrysippus.
Chrysippus, now we're going way back.
Yeah, we're talking ancient Greece here. Chrysippus had this idea that a sound conditional is one where if you take the opposite of the conclusion, it can't be true along with the premise.
Okay, so if you say, if I eat this whole cake, I'll get a stomach ache, Chrysippus would say that it can't also be true, that if I eat this whole cake, I won't get a stomachache.
Right. The premise and the opposite of the conclusion can't coexist. They clash. And Boethius' theses formalize this idea in a way that connexive logic embraces.
So we've got these four principles, Aristotle's theses and Boethius' theses. Are they all you need to have a connexive logic?
Well, they're the most famous ones, the cornerstones, you could say.
But there's more to the story.
There is. One more key ingredient is that implication in connexive logic has to be non-symmetric.
Non-symmetric, meaning what exactly?
It means that if A implies B, It doesn't automatically follow that B implies A.
Well, that makes sense. Like, just because being a cat implies being a mammal, it doesn't mean being a mammal implies being a cat.
Exactly. The direction of the implication matters. There's a flow from antecedent to consequent.
So connexive logic is very careful about preserving that flow of connection.
It is. Now, a philosopher hearing all this might be thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but why should I care? Why bother with connexive logic at all?
Yeah, why rock the boat if classical logic already works pretty well for most things?
Well, there are actually several reasons why connexive logic is worth exploring.
Lay it on me. Convince me.
Okay, first of all, it has strong ties to relevance logic.
Relevance logic. That sounds self-explanatory.
It is. Relevance logic says that for an implication to be valid, the antecedent has to be genuinely relevant to the consequent.
Okay, that seems pretty reasonable.
It does, and connexive logic helps capture this idea of relevance formally. For example, Aristotle's thesis rules out implications where the antecedent is basically the opposite of the consequent.
Because that wouldn't be relevant at all.
Right. It wouldn't make sense to say something like, if the sky is green, then the sky is not green.
Yeah, that's just circular.
Exactly. Connexive logic helps avoid those kinds of irrelevant implications.
So relevance is one big reason. What else?
Well, connexive logic also has a lot to say about different types of conditional statements.
Conditional statements like, if A, then B.
Exactly. And there are all sorts of conditionals out there, not just the simple ones. There are counterfactuals, which talk about what would happen if something were different.
Like, if I'd won the lottery, I would have bought a yacht.
Right. And there are subjunctive conditionals, which deal with hypothetical situations, like, if I were a bird, I would fly south for the winter.
Okay, I see. So connexive logic helps make sense of these trickier kinds of conditionals.
It does. Classical logic often struggles with them, but connexive logic offers a more nuanced way of understanding them.
That's pretty cool. It seems like connexive logic is really expanding the scope of what logic can handle.
It is. And another important area where it shines is in dealing with negation.
Negation, the idea of something not being the case.
Exactly. Connexive logic takes negation very seriously. It pays close attention to the relationship between a statement and its negation.
So it goes beyond just saying not A means A is false.
Right. It looks at the deeper connections between a statement and its negation, and that influences which implications involving negation are considered valid.
I can see how that would get pretty complex.
It can, but it also leads to some very interesting insights.
Okay, so we've got relevance, conditionals, and negation. Are there any other areas where connexive logic is making waves?
Oh, absolutely. For one thing, it challenges the very foundations of classical logic itself.
Really? It goes that deep?
It does. Connexive logic is what we call a contra-classical logic.
Okay, we've heard that term before. Remind me what it means.
It means that it deliberately rejects certain core principles of classical logic.
So it's not afraid to go against the grain.
Not at all. It's saying, hey, there might be other ways of thinking about logical consequence that are just as valid, if not more so, than the classical way.
That's a bold move. I like it.
And it's not just a theoretical exercise either. Connexive logic is starting to find applications in various fields.
Really, like where?
Well, for one thing, researchers in cognitive psychology are using it to study how people actually reason with conditionals in everyday language.
So they're testing whether people's intuitions about if A then B actually line up with the rules of connexive logic.
Exactly. And some studies suggest that they do.
That's fascinating. So connexive logic might actually be closer to how our brains naturally work.
It's possible. And that has implications for how we design things like artificial intelligence systems that need to reason and make decisions.
Oh, that's interesting. So connexive logic could help us build smarter machines.
Potentially. And another area where it's being explored is knowledge representation.
Knowledge representation, what's that?
It's basically how we store and organize information in a way that computers can understand and use.
Okay, I see. So connexive logic could help us build more reliable knowledge bases.
Exactly, because it's all about ensuring that the relationships between different pieces of information are consistent and make sense.
So it's not just about having a bunch of facts. It's about how those facts connect to each other.
That's right. And those connections need to be coherent if we want to draw meaningful conclusions and make informed decisions.
This is really starting to open up a whole new perspective on logic.
It is. And it gets even more exciting when you consider the potential applications in areas like deontic logic.
Deontic logic.
Deontic logic is all about reasoning about obligations and permissions. What we ought to do, what we're allowed to do.
Oh, that's a big one. Morality and ethics.
Exactly. And connexive logic might offer some new tools for thinking about those issues more rigorously.
So it could even help us make better moral decisions.
It's possible it could help us clarify the connections between our values, our beliefs, and the actions we take.
This is really blowing my mind.
And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, there are even some folks exploring what happens when you apply connexive logic to mathematics.
Wait, mathematics,
Yeah,
the most logical of all disciplines.
yeah. They're asking, what if we rebuilt the foundations of arithmetic or set theory using connexive principles? What would that look like?
Wow, that's next level stuff.
It is, and it shows just how far-reaching the implications of connexive logic can be.
So we've talked about all these different flavors of connexive logic. Demi-connexive, quasi-connexive, and hyper-connexive.
Yeah, there's a whole spectrum of them.
What exactly makes them different?
Well, it mainly comes down to which of those core principles, Aristotle's theses and Boethius's theses, they accept as valid.
Oh, so it's like they're picking and choosing which aspect of connectedness are most important to them.
Exactly, and some of them even tweak those principles, making them stronger or weaker in different ways.
So it's like fine-tuning the level of strictness when it comes to connection.
That's a good way to put it.
Now, on a more technical level, how do you actually build a connexive logic? What are the tools of the trade?
Well, one common approach is to use algebraic semantics.
Algebraic semantics. That sounds abstract.
It is, but it's basically about representing logical systems using mathematical structures. It lets you model implication and negation in ways that fit with connexive principles.
Okay, so it's a way of translating logical ideas into mathematical language.
Exactly. And another key technique is to use something called ternary relational frames.
Ternary relational frames. Now we're getting really technical.
A bit, but the basic idea is that instead of just having two truth values, true and false, you add a third component that represents a kind of relationship between different propositions.
So it's like saying, okay, A and B might both be true, but are they connected in a meaningful way?
Right. And this third component helps capture that notion of relevance that's so central to connexive logic.
That makes sense. So it's a way of representing connection in a more nuanced way than just truth and falsity.
Exactly. And along with these ternary frames often comes something called the Rautley star, a special kind of negation that works well in these non-classical settings.
The Rautley star sounds mysterious.
It's a powerful tool for defining negation in a way that fits with connexive logic.
So it's like a new and improved kind of negation.
You could say that. And there are other approaches too, like subtraction negation, which sees negation as a kind of removal of content.
That's an interesting way to think about it.
And then there's Boolean relatedness logic, which explicitly adds a relatedness relation between formulas alongside the standard logical operators.
So it's like building relevance right into the system.
Exactly. And FDE-based logics use four truth values, true only, false only, both, and neither, to give a more fine-grained analysis of truth and falsity.
4 truth values. That's twice as many as usual.
It is, but it helps avoid some of the paradoxes that can arise in classical logic, particularly when dealing with negation and conditionals.
So it's like having a higher resolution picture of truth.
Yeah, a more detailed view. And finally, people are even exploring connexive ideas within modal logic, which deals with concepts like possibility and necessity.
Wow, it seems like there's no shortage of ways to build a connexive logic.
No shortage at all. It's a very active area of research with lots of different perspectives and approaches.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the technical details of connexive logic. But stepping back for a moment, where did these ideas actually come from?
Well, the roots of connexive logic go way back to ancient philosophy.
Even further back than Chrysippus.
Yeah. The real pioneers were Aristotle and Boethius, the same folks behind those famous theses we talked about earlier.
So they were already grappling with these ideas of connection and relevance.
They were. But it wasn't until the 20th century that connexive logic really started to take shape as a distinct field of study.
Who are the key figures in that modern development?
There were several, but some of the most important names are Nelson, Angel, and McCall.
So they picked up where the ancients left off.
They did, and they developed formal systems that could capture those ancient intuitions in a rigorous way.
That's pretty amazing. It's like a conversation across centuries.
It is, and it's a conversation that's still going strong today.
Now, I know there's some debate about whether Aristotle and Boethius actually intended those theses to be interpreted the way they are in modern connexive logic.
Right. Some scholars think their original ideas might have been a bit more nuanced, maybe only applying to certain kinds of conditionals.
So it's possible we've modernized their thinking a bit.
That's a possibility. But regardless of the historical details, the challenge of developing consistent and intuitively satisfying connexive logics remains a central focus.
So it's a living tradition, constantly evolving and being refined.
Exactly.
As we wrap up this deep dive into connexive logic, what would you say are the most important takeaways for someone who's just encountering these ideas for the first time?
Well, the first thing to remember is that connexive logic is a fundamental challenge to the way we normally think about logical implication.
It's a different way of seeing the connections between ideas.
It is. It's about more than just truth and falsity. It's about ensuring that there's a genuine, meaningful link between the premises and the conclusion of an argument.
A real flow of reason.
Exactly. And that leads to the acceptance of these principles like Aristotle's theses and Boethius's theses, which classical logic just throws out.
Because they demand that extra level of connection.
Right. They say that a proposition shouldn't imply its own opposite, and a single premise shouldn't lead to contradictory conclusions.
It's about keeping things coherent and sensible.
That's a good way to put it.
And it's important to remember that connexive logic isn't a monolithic thing.
Right. It's more like a family of related logics, each with its own take on what connectedness really means.
So there's room for exploration and debate.
Absolutely. And the tools used to build these logics are just as diverse. From algebra to ternary frames, there's a whole toolbox of techniques for capturing these alternative views of logical consequence.
And the historical roots of these ideas go incredibly deep.
They do. From ancient Greece to the present day, philosophers and logicians have been grappling with the nature of connection and relevance.
So it's a long and fascinating journey.
It is. And ultimately, connexive logic forces us to reconsider some of our most basic assumptions about how logic works.
It makes us question what it really means for one idea to follow from another.
Exactly. And that's a question worth pondering, even if you ultimately decide that classical logic is the way to go.
So a final thought for our listeners.
Connexive logic invites us to look beyond the surface of logical arguments and ask whether there's a real, meaningful connection at play.
To see if the implications actually make sense.
Exactly. And that kind of critical thinking can enrich our understanding of not just logic, but of the world around us.
It's a challenge to our assumptions and a reminder that there's always more to explore.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those connections for yourselves.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.